Una Crown was an 86-year-old woman who was slain in her home in England in 2013. A few bloodied nail clippings helped to convict her perpetrator 12 years later. On January 13, 2013, Una Crown's niece, Judy Payne's husband John, went to pick up Una from her home in the Cambridgeshire town of Wisbech, England, for Sunday lunch. The curtains were drawn, so he went to a neighbor to collect a spare key. He discovered 86-year-old Una inside lying face down in a pool of blood in the hallway, and a strong burning smell hung in the air. He called 999 and said that something weird had happened. The police were sent to the scene and decided Una had accidentally set herself on fire and that injuries to her neck had been caused by her tight scarf when she fell. This meant that her home was not treated as a crime scene. A terrible mistake her family feared might cost them justice on Una's behalf. Former postmistress Una lived alone in the bungalow she once shared with her late husband Ron. Judy, Una's niece, said, "She was just a sweet little lady, would not hurt anybody." She fondly remembers a forthright aunt who spoke her mind in more ways than one. At the time, Simon Gledhill was an acting sergeant at Cambridgeshire Police. He has since admitted that they made a terrible mistake, the mistake being that Una's home was not treated like a crime scene. The police, firefighters, paramedics, and undertakers all walked around the house, and some even touched Una's body to move things around. The paramedics rummaged through drawers, and blood was transferred to a light switch. The first person to raise suspicions about Una's demise was not a police officer, but a firefighter who urged them to secure the scene. It was not until 2 days later, after a post-mortem examination, that Una's demise was finally deemed suspicious. John Bolton, who bought the bungalow after Una's passing, said, "There is no way anybody could fall over like that and splatter blood and finger marks on the wall." He said that there was blood on the carpet and handprints on the wall when he first viewed the property. Mr. Bolton could not believe that the police thought her passing was accidental. A professional standards review found that the first police officers at Una's home breached the standards of professional behavior. Their actions were not, however, considered deliberately neglectful. A number of people were arrested in the case, but nobody was charged, and the case lingered for years as unsolved. Una's family feared her perpetrator might never be caught. 10 years later, in 2023, Judy said that she believed the case would have been solved if it was not for the big mistakes in the police investigation. The case was then taken over by Detective Superintendent Ian Moore, who acknowledged the previous errors and reiterated the force's apology to Una's family. Then, finally, there was a breakthrough in the case. After Una's demise, bloodied fingernail clippings were taken from her body and was stored. New techniques meant the police could take a fresh look at those clippings and see what new clues they might hold. DNA that was found beneath her nails matched to former kitchen installer David Newton from Magazine Close in Wisbech, who had done odd jobs for Una. The DNA found under Una's nails allowed the police to cast doubt on Newton's claims that he had not seen Una on the day or days before her demise, and it places him at the scene of the crime. Newton had a history of unnerving behavior. In 2000, he sold a raffle ticket to one of Una's relatives. Afterwards, when she thought he had left, she went to get changed in her bedroom, but while in her underwear, she realized he was still there. She told the police that Newton said he loved her, adding she was really frightened. She said, "He was probably drunk. He normally is." Una's neighbor, Paula Birch, for whom Newton also did odd jobs, told how Newton would sometimes go to her window while she was in bed and, despite her asking him to leave, would sometimes ignore this and hover outside with a cigarette. In April, Newton was arrested and charged. His trial started in January 2025, 12 years after the crime took place, and his defense team told the court, in the absence of the jury, the issue of other possible suspects was a live issue. The prosecution said that there was no evidence she passed away during a robbery, instead claiming that cash was taken from her purse as an afterthought. The trial heard 70-year-old Newton took money from her handbag and spent it at an ex-serviceman's club the day after her demise. Jurors spent about 29 hours in deliberation, longer than they heard evidence in the trial for, before finding Newton guilty of ending Una's life. Detective Superintendent Moore said, "In 2013, an 86-year-old widow was robbed of her life. Nothing can take the pain of this heartbreaking case away, but I hope today's verdict gives Una's family the closure they deserve and the answers they have longed for. My thoughts are very much with them at this time." Sentencing Judge Mr. Justice Neil Garnham told Newton, "This was a ferocious and sustained knife attack on a defenseless old lady in her own home." There was an intake of breath and whispers of yes from the public gallery as the sentence was passed on February 14, 2025. He was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 21 years. The defendant appeared to raise an eyebrow before swiftly being led to the cells. Detective Sergeant Dan Harper read a statement outside the court afterwards on behalf of Una's family. "In 2013, we heard how our auntie Una had passed away. 2 days later, we heard it was deliberate, and our world stopped. An elderly widow watching her favorite TV program, feeling warm and safe in her own home. The attack was brutal, horrific, and an assault on a defenseless, frail, elderly widow. The verdict in this case has prevented him from causing further distress and misery to others. Since her untimely and savage passing, 3 close family relatives, including her brother, have sadly passed away, not knowing her perpetrator has been brought to justice. The family thanked all who have helped to get to this point and said that they could carry on with their lives, knowing justice has been done." A mother has been keeping a dark secret for over 2 decades. In March 1998, a man walking his dog in the Callum area of Warrington, England, spotted something wrapped in 2 knotted bin bags. Inside, he discovered the body of a newborn baby boy. With no immediate clue where the baby had come from, local people gave him the name Callum, after the Callum area where he was found. In the days after baby Callum's discovery, tests found that wads of tissue paper had been inserted into his mouth and throat, confirming his end was not likely to have been an accident. Forensic investigators found blood from the baby's mother on the bin bags and were able to extract a full DNA profile. A list was drawn up of teenage girls who had been absent from 3 local schools around the time of baby Callum's demise, so that their DNA could be tested. A number of young women were even arrested after their families suggested to the detectives that they might be involved, but the original investigation stalled and the case went cold for years. Around 20 miles away from where baby Callum was found, in Croxteth, Liverpool, his mother had not told a soul, not even her husband. Not only had she hidden the birth and passing of baby Callum, but no one had ever known that she had been pregnant. The baby's father would spend the next 25 years oblivious to the fact he had fathered a second child. Years later, it was their older son, born in 1996, who inadvertently unlocked the mystery of Callum's identity. In 2016, the first review of the National DNA Database was ordered, resulting in a list of hundreds of names of potentially linked people to the case. Some attempts had been made to narrow it down by the time Detective Inspector Hannah Friend took on the case in 2021. Early in the case, the detectives were thrilled when a name caught their attention. It was someone who lived near where Callum was found and had been spoken to by the original investigation team, but they had not given a statement or had their details recorded properly. Detective Hannah said, "We thought maybe this is somebody who slipped through the net, and as it turned out, it was not at all. We were all so disappointed because we thought we had solved it." After 2 years of ruling out potential suspects from the original list, Detective Hannah made the decision in 2023 to run a new trawl of the National DNA Database. She was confronted with a fresh list of roughly 500 names and, in her words, a new search for a needle in a haystack. But this time was different. Amongst the names was Matthew Sharkey. Initially, his name was one among several interesting DNA profiles, which were sent to a forensic scientist for a more detailed comparison with baby Callum. A few months before baby Callum's mother was arrested, Detective Hannah got an email from a scientist with the subject heading, "Are you sitting down?" The email confirmed that Matthew was a direct relative of baby Callum, with a 1 in 36 billion likelihood of him not being related. Detective Hannah Friend said, "We were able to identify a woman who we thought was the mother of Callum, and that was Joanne Sharkey." The investigation team were at pains to be as sure as they could be that they had the right person before moving in, as the next step was a devastating one. Detective Friend said, "I did not want to be walking through that door and destroying people's lives." Joanne was sitting on a couch in pink pajamas bearing the word "Mum" when the police went in on July 28, 2023. Body-worn camera footage showed her listening to the arresting officer, wide-eyed but quiet and compliant. Gesturing towards her stunned husband, Neil, she told the arresting officer, "He does not know anything about this." With no evidence at that stage about how Callum had passed away or who the person responsible was, both parents were arrested. A court later heard that, unbeknown to them, they were recorded as they sat in the back of a police car on the way to the custody suite. Joanne said to her husband, "I am not going to deny nothing. It is what it is, isn't it? I did it." In hours of police interviews, Joanne explained how in the summer of 1998, she had become pregnant for a second time, in the grip of severe but undiagnosed postnatal depression following the birth of their first son, Matthew. She said her reaction had been, "I cannot do this again." She told the police that she had been terrified to see news coverage about baby Callum and think that was me. She said, "It is haunting, something you think about every day. You try and push it out, but it creeps back in." Early on, she had been unsure if she was pregnant, but there were no doubts from around 5 months in. She told the police that her husband's long hours and shifts meant that they had been strangers in the night, and it had not been difficult to hide her growing bump by wearing baggy clothing. In a remarkable statement later read in court by Joanne's barrister, Neil himself described how he was not the greatest husband and father, and how he blamed himself for what had happened. Joanne told the police that her memory was scattered with blanks about Callum's birth, but she recalled how Neil and Matthew must have been out of the house. She also could not recall precisely what she did to end his life, only that she felt she just had to make him quiet. Medical evidence suggested that Callum had likely been subjected to some form of mechanical asphyxiation. Joanne described driving aimlessly until she came to the spot near Gulliver's World theme park where she dumped Callum's body. It later emerged that she was spotted on that day by a retired man out for a walk, who remembered a woman emerging from the woodland looking visibly upset. One of the residents of the cul-de-sac in Liverpool described the moment she learned her neighbor for more than 30 years had been charged with ending the life of her baby boy. She said, "When I heard about it and I saw her name, I thought, that is not that woman. That is not the same woman that we have lived by all these years." Another neighbor said that when the police first arrived at the family's immaculate semi-detached house in July 2023, she had thought one of the lodgers they sometimes hosted must have been in trouble. It simply did not make sense that someone like kind, funny, and normal council worker Joanne Sharkey could have committed a crime, but the truth was that the detectives had finally cracked a cold case that had lingered unsolved on the books of Cheshire Police for 25 years. From this point, the questions left were complex legal and medical ones to determine whether Joanne was capable of forming a rational judgment when she ended Callum's life, and was she guilty of slaying or manslaughter. The evidence from psychiatrists commissioned by both the defense and the prosecution all pointed the same way. Joanne's mental illness meant she had a partial defense. Detective Friend said, "My responsibility as an investigator is to follow the evidence and to develop that evidence so we can seek the truth. My personal feelings about Joanne? You wonder on one hand how anybody could do this to a beautiful child, a precious child who deserved to live. On the other hand, I think how awful to be in this situation where you think that is the best and only option that you have. Joanne's fate was decided at Liverpool Crown Court on April 4, 2025, by Judge Mrs. Justice Eady, who concluded that her postnatal depression had impaired her judgment so severely the case called for compassion rather than punishment. She was given a 2-year prison sentence suspended for 2 years, with a requirement for mental health treatment. For Detective Inspector Friend and her team, that promise made by Callum's graveside in 2021 had been fulfilled. She added, "We will, once sentencing has concluded, go back to his grave to lay some flowers and just pay him our respects, and I hope that he can rest in peace." For Joanne, the past quarter of a century of her life had, in her own words, been spent waiting for that knock on the door. A woman's remains have been identified 17 years after her legs were found in a San Diego dumpster and the perpetrator was discovered close to home. On October 5, 2003, legs were found in a dumpster at an apartment complex in the 1600 block of Hilton Head Court in Rancho San Diego, California. When the legs were discovered after a 911 call from a worker in the complex, there was little evidence to go on. The complex was searched for other body parts, but none were found. Though investigators at the time were able to determine the remains belonged to an adult female victim, the victim's identity and circumstances of her demise remained a mystery for nearly 2 decades. In June 2020, cold case investigators began using investigative genetic genealogical techniques to solve the case. The San Diego County Sheriff's Department said in a news release, "In this case, the goal was to find relatives whose own DNA profile matched those of an unidentified victim. Once the victim's profile was developed, it was uploaded into commercial genealogy sites that allow law enforcement agencies to participate." In late 2020, the authorities identified the remains as Laurie Potter's. Shortly after, the detectives began an intense investigation into Laurie's life at the time of her demise. Sheriff Lieutenant Thomas Seaver said, "Once we identified Laurie Potter, we went back through her life and tried to identify who she was, where she was living, who were her friends or family during that time frame." The investigators then said that there was substantial and conclusive evidence that Laurie's husband, Jack Potter, was responsible for her demise, but declined to go into specifics. In 2003, the married couple was living in Temecula, California. Laurie was 54 at the time. She was never reported missing. That is because, according to the investigators, only one person knew about her disappearance, her then husband. Her friends and family had not heard from her in years, but were alarmed to learn that her life was taken. Jack was arrested on May 12, 2021 at his Rancho Cucamonga apartment and was being held without bail at the San Diego Central Jail. According to Troy Dugal, one of the lead investigators in Laurie's case, her family were very happy that she has been identified. They were under the impression that she was just living somewhere else. He said, "Nobody knew, and they are extremely happy once they get over the grief of Laurie being deceased, that we identified and arrested the suspect. So it is bittersweet." The authorities believe that Laurie's life was ended shortly before she was found, either the day before or the day of, but did not specify how she lost her life. In February 2025, 72-year-old Jack Potter pleaded guilty to second-degree slaying and could be sentenced in May to 15 years to life in state prison. He remains in county jail without bail. An Albuquerque man was found guilty of all charges in connection to an assault that occurred more than 30 years ago. On November 26, 1994, a 43-year-old woman named Susan was running near the Rio Grande Nature Center State Park in New Mexico when she was attacked and brutally assaulted. Despite the best efforts of the detectives, the perpetrator could not be found and the case went cold. Susan passed away 19 years later in 2013, and her assault kit remained untested until 2020. Then, 2 years later, in 2022, there was a DNA match to an Albuquerque man, Gilbert Contreras, and he was taken into custody. On November 25, 2024, a jury found him guilty of 2 counts of criminal penetration and kidnapping. Before the jury issued their verdict, they heard from both the prosecution and the defense in the case. Prosecutor Jack Bennett Jacks said the following during the sentencing hearing. He beat her, kicked her, forced her to a secluded area by the river in the Bosque, and brutally and violently assaulted her. He continued, naked, bound, and still gagged, she waited. She played lifeless. She tried to seem unconscious until she felt like she could start to work her way back toward the trail she had been running on that day. She had been beaten with a rock, tied with strips of her own clothing, and she was indecently assaulted twice. The state read a statement from the woman who came across Susan that day back in 1994. It read, "Her face was twice the swelling of the normal face. Her eyes were like little slits. She had big bruises and blood coming down her mouth." The judge also heard from her daughter, who said that her mother passed away before ever seeing justice. In closing arguments, the defense and prosecution focused on the credibility of the DNA evidence. Defense attorney Adam D. Oakey said, "There was no due diligence in this investigation, not in 1994, and not today. There were issues with the lab, all the way through which was glossed over. The prosecution dismissed that claim, saying that there were no issues with the evidence or the lab it was processed in. The defense also claimed that at one point, there could have been a consensual relationship between the victim and Contreras, to which the prosecution responded, "It was not mentioned in opening, and there is no evidence of it." The state argued for the max sentencing of 72 years because of how violent the crime was and Contreras' previous criminal record, while the defense wanted 15 to 20 years because he was already almost 60 years old. Ultimately, Judge Courtney Weeks sentenced Gilbert Contreras on March 6, 2025 to 54 years behind bars and said Contreras will most likely spend the rest of his life in prison. Judge Courtney Weeks said, "There is a long felony history. There is a history of violent crime with Mr. Contreras. I do not think the court has to reiterate that this is an extremely violent and an extremely heinous case." The man responsible for the brutal slaying of a Minnesota woman in 1986 has been convicted and sentenced, but a judge reversed his conviction and he needed to be proven guilty once again. On July 16, 1986, 38-year-old Nancy Daugherty was found deceased in her Chisholm, Minnesota home by police conducting a welfare check. The officials said that she had been beaten, indecently assaulted, and strangled. During the investigation, witnesses reported hearing a woman screaming in the early morning hours. BCA scientists obtained a full DNA suspect profile from the male DNA that was found on the victim and at the scene. At that time, the DNA did not match any known persons in the criminal DNA database, and the case went cold. Over the years, the investigators interviewed and collected DNA from more than 100 people. In 2020, 34 years after the crime, the authorities obtained a DNA sample from Michael Allen Carbo Jr. of Chisholm with his consent. The Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension confirmed that the DNA sample taken from Carbo was a match to the male DNA found on the victim and at the 1986 crime scene. Carbo was arrested in July of that year, and in 2022, he was found guilty in the first degree while committing criminal conduct for ending the life of Nancy. He was sentenced to life in prison at the time. In May 2024, the Minnesota Supreme Court reversed Carbo's conviction, saying the judge in the 2022 trial unjustly denied his defense's attempt to submit evidence of a possible alternative suspect. Carbo's second trial started on January 13, 2025. County Attorney Kim Mackey said, "Our thoughts go out to the family of Nancy Daugherty. This has been a long road to justice. The family of Miss Nancy has shown the utmost strength, and we thank them for their support from the beginning to the end." In January 2025, a jury found the 56-year-old guilty for the second time. Carbo's original sentencing was set for March 4th, but shortly before his defense team requested an acquittal. Carbo's defense submitted that request to Judge Robert Friday on February 14th. They are hoping for a third trial. They maintain that Carbo is innocent and another person is responsible for taking Nancy's life. The prosecutors have argued that DNA connects Carbo to the crime. Carbo's case will now revert to district court. The St. Louis County Attorney's Office, which originally charged him, said it was disappointed in the decision and remains committed to prosecuting Mr. Carbo.